The true ruler of ancient Egypt was not always the man wearing the double crown. For centuries, a different kind of power held sway from the shadows of colossal temples, an economic empire built not on conquest but on divine favor and brilliant administration. This is the story of the cult of Amun, and by the end of this exploration, you will understand exactly how a priesthood amassed enough wealth to rival the pharaohs themselves. How did land, gold, and faith weave together into a network that nearly broke a kingdom? What does it mean when the bankers and the priests become more powerful than the king? The journey from spiritual authority to financial dominance is one of history's most fascinating puzzles. What do you believe is the ultimate source of power in any society? The transformation of Amun from a local wind god into the supreme deity of the Egyptian pantheon was a masterstroke of theological branding. It began with the rise of Thebes as Egypt's political capital. The rulers of the New Kingdom, starting around 1550 BC, needed a unifying national god to match their expanding empire. They chose Amun, but to give him universal appeal, they merged his identity with that of Ra, the ancient and venerated sun god. This was not a simple name change. It was a profound theological innovation that created Amun-Ra, a deity whose power was both hidden like the wind and manifest like the blazing sun. This new composite god became the ultimate source of creation and the divine father of the pharaoh himself. Every military campaign a pharaoh launched was now seen as the will of Amun-Ra. Every victory was a gift from the god, and every tribute that flowed into Egypt was in essence his property. This relationship placed the priesthood in an extraordinarily powerful position. They were not merely caretakers of a temple. They became the official interpreters of the god's will, the only ones who could perform the rituals that kept the cosmos in balance and ensured the pharaoh's right to rule. Think of it this way: the pharaoh held the sword, but the priests held the manual that explained why the sword was righteous, and for this essential service, the kingdom paid a perpetual fee. Pharaoh after pharaoh would return from successful wars and proclaim that all the captured lands, slaves, and treasures were dedicated to Amun-Ra, given in eternal gratitude. These were not symbolic gestures. They were legally binding donations inscribed on stone for all time that transferred real wealth directly into the temple treasuries. The priesthood, therefore, built its initial fortune on a foundation of divine legitimacy. Their economic power began not with a business plan, but with a sacred promise between the king and the gods, a promise the priests were uniquely qualified to administer. This spiritual capital became the seed from which a vast and worldly empire would grow. This divine favor translated into staggering, tangible wealth. The most direct and powerful engine of the cult's fortune was the unwavering generosity of the pharaohs themselves. Following a triumphant military campaign, it became customary for a king to express his gratitude to Amun-Ra with a gift that was both magnificent and permanent. He would dedicate vast tracts of newly conquered land to the god's temple. These were not symbolic gestures. We are talking about entire towns in regions like Nubia, complete with their fields, vineyards, herds, and most crucially, the people who lived and worked there. These populations, captured during conflict, became part of the temple's permanent workforce, their labor now fueling the god's estate instead of the crown's. Imagine the economic impact. With a single royal decree, a fertile region producing grain, livestock, and other goods was legally removed from the state's tax rolls and placed entirely under the administration of the high priest of Amun. These donations were so significant they were often carved into stone stelae, creating an unbreakable divine contract. The inscription served as both a monument to the king's piety and a permanent title deed for the priesthood. This practice created the first pillar of the cult's economic empire, a foundation of tax-free land and bound labor that operated as a parallel agricultural system entirely independent of the royal palace. The temple was no longer just a place of worship. It was becoming the landlord of a divine kingdom within a kingdom, its wealth cemented not by market forces but by sacred stone. But divine donations were only the beginning. To turn this sacred real estate into lasting power required a different kind of miracle, one of ledgers and logistics. The true genius of the cult of Amun lay in its ability to manage its blessings with breathtaking efficiency. At the heart of this operation was the temple's own administrative center, known as the White House. This was not a palace for worship, but a bustling economic headquarters, a divine corporation overseeing a sprawling agricultural empire. Across Egypt and deep into Nubia, the temple's scribes kept meticulous records on papyrus of every field, every vineyard, and every herd that belonged to the god. They tracked the yields of barley and emmer wheat, the harvests of flax for linen, and the bounty from orchards and vineyards. Their records were so precise we can still read inventories listing tens of thousands of cattle, a primary measure of wealth in the ancient world. This was far more than simple farming to feed the priests. This was systematic agribusiness on a colossal scale, engineered to generate massive, reliable surpluses. And it was this surplus that became the cult's second pillar of power. What did they do with all that grain and wine? First, it fed the temple's own vast population, a small city of priests, administrators, craftsmen, laborers, and their families, making them entirely self-sufficient. Second, the surplus became a trade commodity, bartered for luxury goods, metals, and timber that the temple lands did not produce. But third, and perhaps most strategically, this surplus acted as a powerful social buffer. In years of poor Nile floods or famine, while the royal granaries might strain, the temple could distribute its own reserves. This act of divinely sanctioned charity transformed the priesthood from distant administrators into vital community protectors, weaving their economic strength directly into the fabric of public loyalty and survival. By mastering the science of estate management, the cult ensured its wealth was active, growing, and independent. They were no longer just recipients of royal gifts. They were peerless managers of a divine economy that rivaled the state's own, and with that management came a quiet, undeniable autonomy. Yet the power of grain and land, immense as it was, could only build so high. To construct a true rival to the throne, the cult needed something more elemental, something that represented value in its purest and most universal form. They turned their gaze south toward the sun-baked mountains and desolate wadis of Nubia and the eastern desert. Here lay the third, and perhaps most decisive, pillar of their empire, direct control over the sources of Egypt's most coveted treasures. The priesthood secured not just the products, but the very mines that produced gold, electrum, and precious stones like turquoise. Royal inscriptions proudly detail expeditions to these remote regions, but look closer. These missions were often led by high-ranking temple officials or carried the explicit blessing of Amun. The divine claim was clear: the gold of the desert belonged to the god. When laden barges returned north up the Nile, they carried more than raw material. They carried the ultimate economic instrument. Gold was the hard currency of the ancient world, the one substance that held its value across borders and could be traded for anything, from the finest Lebanese cedar to rare incense from the land of Punt. This gave the cult something the agricultural estates could not: immense liquidity. Imagine a modern institution that controls not just vast real estate, but also the primary source of a nation's gold reserves. That was the position of the high priest of Amun. They could finance the construction of colossal new temple pylons without asking the royal treasury. They could commission fleets of trade ships to sail the Red Sea. they could acquire the most exotic luxuries to adorn the god's statue, making his shrine even more magnificent, which in turn attracted more donations and pilgrims in a powerful cycle of sacred spectacle. This control of precious resources embedded the temple at the very core of Egypt's material wealth, transforming it from a wealthy landowner into a central bank with a divine mandate. The god's treasury was not just full, it was the engine of the kingdom's prosperity, and the men who managed that engine held a form of power that was both silent and absolute. But controlling the mines was only half the equation. True economic mastery required the final, transformative step, turning raw treasure into objects of even greater worth and influence. This was the work of the fourth pillar, the temple's own manufacturing empire, housed within the sacred walls of Karnak itself. Deep inside the complex, far from the public courtyards, lay a hive of industry known as the House of Gold. This was not a metaphorical name. It was a literal, secure workshop where master goldsmiths and lapidaries, all permanent employees of the god, performed their alchemy. They took the raw gold from Nubian mines and the turquoise from Sinai and transformed them into the breathtaking statues of deities, the intricate ritual vessels, and the dazzling jewelry that adorned the temple's inner sanctuaries. Yet the workshops extended far beyond precious metals. Separate ateliers hummed with the work of weavers producing the finest temple linen, carpenters crafting sacred barks from imported cedar, and perfumers blending rare imported resins into the incense that filled the halls. This internalized production served a brilliant dual purpose. First, it supplied the cult's own insatiable need for opulence, as each ritual demanded new and magnificent items to maintain the god's favor. But second, and more crucially, it created a stream of finished luxury goods of the highest quality. These items, bearing the implicit blessing of Amun, became incredibly valuable commodities. They were used in high-level diplomatic gift exchanges with foreign rulers, a practice that built political alliances in the god's name. They could also be traded internally for other necessities, ensuring the temple never had to spend its gold or grain to acquire what it could make itself. Think of it as the ultimate form of vertical integration. The cult of Amun controlled the entire chain, from the gold in the mountain to the polished statue in the shrine, and every step of value added in between. This meant they captured the full profit margin, minimized reliance on outside merchants, and created a self-sufficient economic loop of astonishing complexity. The temple was no longer just a landlord or a bank. It was a divine corporation with its own fully integrated supply chain, producing the very symbols of power that everyone else in the kingdom sought to possess. Their wealth was now active, multiplying, and beautifully self-contained. So the god's wealth was no longer confined by geography or even by the Nile's annual flood. It flowed along invisible lines of commerce that stretched across seas and deserts. The fifth pillar of the cult's power was its command of trade networks and divine diplomacy. With coffers full of gold and granaries overflowing, the high priests of Amun possessed the capital to fund ventures that reached far beyond Egypt's traditional borders. They were not just landowners, they were international merchants operating under a sacred banner. Temple agents, often scribes or mid-level priests with a keen eye for value, would have traveled alongside royal trade missions. Their cargo holds were filled with the very products their own estates produced, premium Egyptian linen and the finest papyrus, along with that most irresistible commodity, Nubian gold. In return, their ships returned to Thebes laden with cedar logs from the forests of Lebanon, essential for constructing the massive doors and sacred barks within Karnak. They brought fragrant oils from the Aegean, resins from Punt for incense, and luxurious ebony and ivory from deeper in Africa. Every transaction served a dual purpose. It acquired physical materials the temple needed for its rituals and expansions, but it also wove the cult into the very fabric of regional power dynamics. This trade was framed not as mere commerce but as a sacred duty. Foreign lands rich in resources were often referred to in inscriptions as God's lands, territories that existed to supply the divine household. This gave every trade agreement a layer of religious justification, turning a business deal into an act of piety. The strategic benefits were immense. These networks provided the priesthood with something as valuable as gold, timely intelligence. Through their foreign contacts, they learned of political shifts, new trade routes, and potential conflicts long before the news reached the royal court. They built relationships with foreign merchants and minor rulers that were loyal not to the pharaoh, but to the institution that reliably provided gold and grain. This positioned the high priest of Amun as a crucial geo-economic player, a silent partner in Egypt's foreign policy whose influence was felt in distant ports and desert caravans. The cult's power was now truly boundless, a perfect fusion of spiritual authority, agricultural might, industrial capacity, and global commercial reach. How could any single pharaoh, bound by tradition and the limits of his own lifespan, hope to compete with an institution that operated on such a scale and with such patience? Behind every grain of gold and every ledger entry stood the true engine of this divine economy: people. The sixth and most vital pillar of the cult's power was its immense, expertly managed human capital. An operation of this staggering scale could not function on faith alone. It required a vast, organized workforce that transformed the temple from a wealthy institution into a living, breathing society within a society. At the top of this hierarchy were the elite scribes and administrators, the managers of the White House who orchestrated the entire system. Below them stretched a complex pyramid of specialists, master craftsmen from the House of Gold, skilled weavers and carpenters, priests for daily rituals, guards for the treasuries, and countless farmers, brewers, bakers, and cleaners who maintained the temple's daily life. Many of these roles were not just jobs but hereditary callings. A family might serve as temple goldsmiths or scribes for generations, their identity and loyalty woven inextricably into the institution's history. This created a deep reservoir of expertise and, more importantly, unwavering institutional allegiance that no single pharaoh could easily command. But the labor force extended far beyond these dedicated professionals. The temple also commanded the labor of the hemu, a term often translated as serfs or dependents. These were the people living on the vast tracts of land donated to Amun by grateful pharaohs. They were bound to the soil, their lives and work dedicated to producing the temple's agricultural wealth. For massive construction projects like adding a new pylon to Karnak, the cult could also conscript additional labor from the surrounding population, a right granted by its immense influence. In return for their work, this entire workforce was paid not in coin, but in the very substances the temple produced in abundance: daily rations of bread, beer, fish, vegetables, and oil, distributed from the temple's own overflowing storerooms. This created a perfectly closed economic loop. The workers produced the surplus, and the surplus fed the workers, all under the benevolent gaze of Amun. The genius of this system was its profound social impact. By providing reliable sustenance, housing, and social standing to thousands of individuals and their families, the cult of Amun became the central pillar of the Theban community. A person's livelihood, their family's security, and their sense of purpose were all tied directly to the temple's economic health. When the gods' granaries were full, the city prospered. This meant that the population's deepest loyalties increasingly lay not with a distant pharaoh in Memphis or Pi-Ramesses, but with the local temple administration that put food on their tables and defined their place in the world. The cult had successfully monetized divine favor into social stability, building a power base of human hearts and minds that was, in the end, far more durable than any stockpile of gold. This vast and intricate economic machine, however, operated under one final, decisive advantage: a legal shield that protected every ounce of its wealth. The seventh pillar of the cult's power was a sweeping tax exemption and fiscal independence granted directly by the pharaohs themselves. While ordinary Egyptians faced taxes on their harvests and could be called away for state labor projects, the estates of Amun enjoyed a remarkable immunity. This was not an informal understanding, but a formal royal decree carved in stone for all to see. One of the most famous examples is the Nori decree issued by Pharaoh Seti I. In this public proclamation, the king explicitly forbade any royal official, from the highest vizier down to the lowest tax collector, from imposing corvée labor on the personnel of the Amun estate. They could not requisition the temple's ships, its donkeys, or any of the goods produced on its lands. The decree even placed the temple's property under divine protection, warning that anyone who violated these terms would face the wrath of the gods themselves. Think about the staggering economic impact of this privilege. While the royal treasury constantly drained resources from the rest of the kingdom to fund military campaigns, monument building, and the royal court, the wealth generated by the cult of Amun flowed unimpeded. Every bushel of grain, every ingot of gold, every bolt of fine linen it produced remained entirely within its own closed system. There were no external levies, no mandatory contributions to state projects, no forced loans to the crown. This fiscal immunity supercharged every other pillar of their power. The entire surplus from their agricultural empire could be reinvested directly into buying more land, funding more trade expeditions, or expanding their workshops. The gold from their mines wasn't taxed away to pay soldiers. It was used to gild another statue in Karnak, making the temple even more magnificent and attracting more pilgrims and donations. This legal status transformed the temple from a merely wealthy institution into something far more potent, a sovereign economic entity operating inside the borders of Egypt. It was a kingdom within a kingdom, not in rebellion but by royal sanction. The pharaohs, in their devotion, had accidentally created a rival whose treasury grew in perpetual motion, shielded from the very demands of state that they themselves had to bear. This privilege, meant to honor the god, would ultimately plant the seeds of a profound and destabilizing conflict. For how long can a state function when its most powerful economic engine answers to a different authority and contributes nothing to the common burden? Yet a treasury is only as powerful as its ability to move value. The eighth and final pillar of the cult's dominance was its function as the ultimate bank, a divine financial institution whose vaults were the massive stone magazines that encircled the inner sanctum of Karnak. Picture row upon row of thick-walled storerooms, their doors sealed with the personal seal of the high priest, standing just a stone's throw from the chamber housing the statue of Amun himself. This was not merely storage, it was the most secure economic infrastructure in the ancient world, guarded by both divine presence and human vigilance. Within these cool, dark spaces lay the physical manifestation of every other pillar: towering stacks of grain sacks from the temple estates, chests of raw Nubian gold, and shelves laden with the finished luxury goods from the House of Gold workshops. This centralized repository allowed the priesthood to do something extraordinary: manage the very flow of wealth across time. In years of abundant harvest, they could absorb the massive surplus, preventing a market glut. Then, during the inevitable lean years when the Nile's flood was poor, they could strategically release grain back into the local economy. This act, framed as the gods' benevolence, prevented famine, stabilized prices, and created profound public dependency. But their financial role extended beyond mere storage and distribution. With such vast, tangible reserves, the temple could also extend credit. They could finance a local noble's agricultural expansion or provide the upfront capital for a trading expedition, with loans secured against future harvests or a share of the profits. It is highly likely that the regional elite seeking absolute security would also entrust their own personal valuables, jewelry, deeds, precious metals, to the temple storerooms for safekeeping. This practice transformed the cult of Amun into the central nervous system of the Theban economy. They were not just wealthy, they were the guardians and facilitators of nearly all significant capital in the region. This granted the high priest a form of leverage that was both subtle and overwhelming. A noble family's solvency, a merchant's venture, and a farmer's survival could all hinge on the temple's financial decisions. With the power to grant or withhold credit, to release grain or hold it back, the high priest held the economic lifeblood of the entire community in his hands. The throne commanded armies, but the temple commanded the ledger, and in the quiet arithmetic of supply, demand, and debt, a different kind of sovereignty was being written. The ultimate safeguard for wealth is influence, and the cult of Amun secured this through the most intimate channel possible, the royal bloodline itself. This ninth pillar of power was not a ledger or a mine, but a person, a woman holding one of the most prestigious titles in Egypt, the god's wife of Amun. This was not merely a ceremonial role for a queen or a princess. It was a position of immense spiritual and economic authority, a brilliant fusion of dynasty and divinity that further cemented the temple's unassailable position. As the chief priestess, the god's wife was believed to be the earthly consort of Amun himself, participating in rituals that ensured the god's favor upon the land and the king. With this sacred duty came a very worldly reward, her own vast, independent estates, complete with lands, workforces, and treasuries. She commanded her own staff of administrators and scribes, effectively running a powerful, semi-autonomous economic node that operated in perfect harmony with the greater temple network. Her wealth was the cult's wealth, her influence its influence. This created a direct and unbreakable pipeline between the palace and the sanctuary. A king could send his daughter south to Thebes to become the god's wife, a move that seemed to extend royal control over the powerful priesthood. In reality, it often worked in reverse. Once installed in Thebes, surrounded by the temple's bureaucracy and integrated into its economic system, the princess's primary loyalty frequently shifted. Her success and power were now tied to the prosperity of the cult, not the distant court of her father or brother. By the Third Intermediate Period, a time of political fragmentation, this strategy became a masterstroke of soft power. Ruling dynasties in the north would install their princesses as god's wives in Thebes to secure the loyalty of the wealthy south. These women brought their royal dowries and connections, funneling yet more resources into the temple's coffers, but they also became permanent ambassadors for the priesthood within the royal family itself. The line between state policy and temple interest became hopelessly blurred. A high priest could now advise or even subtly direct the actions of the god's wife, who in turn could sway royal decisions. It was governance through sacred matrimony, a quiet, persistent influence that ensured the temple's economic empire always had a friend, and often a family member, in the very highest rooms of power. The god's wealth was now protected by the crown's own daughters, a final, elegant layer of security woven from lineage and faith. But divine influence could be felt in even more direct and dramatic ways. The 10th pillar of the cult's power moved beyond quiet administration into the realm of public spectacle and perceived divine intervention. This was the strategic use of oracles, a practice that transformed spiritual authority into an immediate tool for economic and political control. During the great public festivals, when the statue of Amun was carried from the temple's inner darkness on a magnificent gilded bark, a unique opportunity arose. The god in procession among his people could be consulted. As the heavy bark was borne on the shoulders of the priests, it would sway and dip. The crowd would pose yes or no questions, and a lunge forward or a dip to the side was interpreted as the god's direct answer. This was not mere theater. It was a sacred legal proceeding. Disputes over inheritance, contested land boundaries, or accusations of theft could be brought before the moving god for a final, unappealable verdict. Think of the immense power this granted the priesthood. They controlled the movement of the bark and thus the interpretation of the divine will. A simple tilt could legitimize the transfer of a valuable parcel of farmland directly into the temple's own estate, resolving a dispute in the god's favor. An oracle could confirm the appointment of a new mayor or regional governor, ensuring that key political positions were filled by individuals loyal to or even chosen by the high priest. The economic implications were profound. A favorable oracle could sanction business deals, validate wills, or absolve debts, all under the unimpeachable authority of Amun himself. This practice allowed the cult to shape the local economic and political landscape in real time, weaving its interests directly into the fabric of law and custom. For the average person, this was not corruption, it was divine governance in action. The system brilliantly reinforced the belief that the god was actively ruling his domain, while ensuring that his earthly representatives benefited from every decree. The temple's wealth was now protected not just by royal decree and military might, but by the perceived voice of heaven, a force no pharaoh could ever safely contradict. Stone itself became a currency of power. The 11th pillar of the cult's dominance was monumental construction, an endless cycle of temple expansion that functioned as a self-funded economic engine. Every new pylon added to Karnak, every colossal statue raised in the forecourt, was far more than an act of devotion. It was a massive, deliberate stimulus project for the Theban region, financed entirely from the temple's own bottomless treasury. The scale of these endeavors is almost impossible to overstate. To erect a single obelisk required quarrying a perfect granite monolith weighing hundreds of tons in distant Aswan, transporting it over 400 miles up the Nile on a specially built barge, and then maneuvering it into position using ramps, ropes, and the coordinated labor of hundreds. This process alone could take years. Now multiply that effort across the construction of entire new halls, towering gateways, and sacred lakes. This perpetual building site guaranteed decades of steady, reliable employment for a vast cross-section of society. Master stonemasons, architects, and sculptors found long-term prestige projects. Barge captains and their crews had constant work. Thousands of unskilled laborers, organized into rotating crews, were paid in the temple's bread and beer for hauling stone and mixing mortar. But the economic ripple effects spread much wider. To feed this army of workers, the temple purchased enormous quantities of food from local farmers and fishermen, injecting its agricultural surplus back into the regional market as cash. It created demand for tools, ropes, timber, and copper chisels, supporting entire industries of craftsmen and suppliers. The construction site at Karnak was, in essence, a bustling economic hub, a divine public works program that circulated wealth and fostered dependency at every level of the community. Each reigning pharaoh, seeking to demonstrate his piety and secure his legacy, felt compelled to add his own monument to the ever-growing complex. Crucially, he often funded these additions through formal donations of land, gold, or prisoners of war directly to the temple. This created a perfect, self-reinforcing cycle. Royal donations increased the temple's wealth, which enabled more construction, which showcased the cult's power, which encouraged the next pharaoh to donate even more to prove his own worthiness. The result was a perpetual motion machine of economic and political influence. The ever-expanding skyline of Karnak, visible for miles, was not just a symbol of faith. It was a towering, stone declaration of financial might, a daily reminder to every citizen that the true source of prosperity and stability in their world was not the distant royal palace, but the god's house whose walls just kept growing. Yet the reach of Amun's wealth stretched far beyond the familiar banks of the Egyptian Nile. To secure a truly unassailable position, the cult needed a territory of its own, a distant land where its authority could operate with near total autonomy. This 12th pillar of power was the profound and lucrative connection to Nubia, the land to the south that served as Egypt's gateway to the deeper riches of Africa. The priests of Amun did not merely trade with Nubia, they effectively colonized it in the god's name. At the strategic heart of this effort stood the holy mountain of Jebel Barkal, a site the Egyptians believed was the southern dwelling place of Amun himself. Here they constructed a massive temple complex, a mirror of Karnak planted hundreds of miles upriver. This was not just a religious outpost, it was a regional capital and economic command center, administering vast tracts of Nubian land that were declared the property of the Theban god. Through this southern temple, the cult directly controlled the critical trade routes that funneled Africa's most coveted treasures northward. Caravans laden with raw gold from desert mines, sleek ebony logs, precious ivory tusks, and exotic animals for royal menageries all passed under the watchful eyes of administrators who answered not to the pharaoh, but to the high priest in Thebes. To manage this remote empire, the Theban priesthood appointed its own loyal overseers, often members of powerful local Nubian families who were elevated to positions of authority. This created a loyal administrative network, a chain of command that ran from the deserts of Kush directly to the treasury rooms at Karnak, completely bypassing the royal capital in the north. The economic result was a direct and private pipeline of wealth. Tribute and revenue from the south flowed steadily into the cult's coffers without ever entering the state's accounting system. This strategic move granted the cult of Amun something priceless: financial independence from the pharaoh's grace. They were no longer just recipients of the king's donated war spoils. They were the primary extractors and beneficiaries of the empire's most lucrative resources, building a power base that was geographically separate, culturally distinct, and economically self-sustaining. In doing so, they planted the seeds for a future where Egypt itself would fracture, with a powerful theocratic state in the south, fueled by Nubian gold, poised to challenge the secular authority of the pharaohs in the north. The god's empire now had its own border, its own capital, and its own source of endless wealth. Even the most magnificent economic machine requires a moment of opportunity to truly challenge the throne. The 13th pillar of the cult's ascent was not something they built, but a landscape they inherited: the slow and steady decline of central royal power. After the long and powerful line of Ramesside pharaohs, the new kingdom entered a twilight phase, an era where the once unquestioned authority of the pharaoh began to crack under immense strain. The royal court faced a cascade of challenges that stretched its resources and attention thin. From the western deserts, incursions by Libyan tribes increased pressure on Egypt's borders, demanding costly military campaigns. Internally, the vast bureaucracy that had run the kingdom for centuries began to show signs of fragmentation, with regional governors acting more independently. Perhaps most critically, a series of low Nile floods led to poor harvests, causing economic hardship and eroding public confidence in the king's divine ability to maintain cosmic order. In this atmosphere of uncertainty, the pharaohs were increasingly preoccupied with immediate survival, with holding the kingdom together at its seams. They simply had less capacity, and perhaps less will, to closely monitor or curb the ambitions of the already powerful Theban priesthood. Their need for the temple's resources became a profound vulnerability. When the royal granaries were low, the state relied on the temple's surplus to feed soldiers or calm restless populations. When the king's legitimacy was questioned, he leaned more heavily on the religious endorsement only the high priest of Amun could provide. This dependence created a dangerous inversion. The institution meant to support the crown was now so essential that the crown could not function without it. In every moment of royal crisis, whether a succession dispute or a foreign threat, the cult of Amun stood as the rock of continuity, its administration never changed with a pharaoh's passing. Its treasuries were not spent on distant wars. Its local authority in Thebes and Nubia remained unchallenged. This allowed the high priests to quietly step into the power vacuums left by a struggling monarchy. They began to assume roles that were once the exclusive domain of the king's own deputies, overseeing regional justice, managing infrastructure projects, and even commanding military units in the south. The temple did not seize power through rebellion. It simply watched as the responsibilities of the state, one by one, were handed to them out of sheer necessity. While kings rose and fell, grappling with problems on all horizons, the god's house in Thebes remained a fortress of stability, its economic empire growing deeper roots with every passing year of royal distraction. This transformation reached its logical conclusion when the high priest himself stepped out from the temple's shadow and onto the political stage. The 14th pillar of the cult's power was the ultimate personal consolidation of authority, where the title of High Priest of Amun ceased to be a religious office and became the throne of a rival kingdom. By the end of the New Kingdom, the southern region of Upper Egypt was no longer governed by a royal appointee answering to a distant pharaoh. It was ruled directly from Thebes by the high priest, a man who now wore multiple crowns of power. Consider the case of Herihor. He began his career not in the temple's scriptorium, but as a general in the Egyptian army. His rise to the pinnacle of the priesthood was a masterstroke of political maneuvering. He did not simply become the chief servant of Amun. He inscribed for himself the traditional titles of vizier, the kingdom's top administrator, and chief of the army, its supreme military commander. In temple reliefs, he took the final, audacious step of having his name written inside a royal cartouche, the oval emblem reserved solely for pharaohs. This was not a quiet power grab. It was a public declaration of sovereignty. With this consolidation, every lever of control in southern Egypt now rested in a single pair of hands. The temple's vast economic empire, with its grain, gold, and workshops, now had direct and immediate access to military force and civil law. The high priest could levy troops from the population to defend the temple's interests or to expand them. He could order the collection of taxes from any lands not already owned by Amun, funneling that revenue directly into Thebes instead of north to the royal capital. He could conduct official diplomacy with foreign states, negotiating treaties and trade agreements in his own name. Thebes became the seat of a fully functional government, a theocratic state operating in parallel to the weakening pharaonic administration in the north. The god's wealth was no longer just an influence on politics. It had become the very foundation of a new political reality, where the banker, the priest, and the king were finally and undeniably the same man. The ultimate proof of the temple's power was not written on papyrus or carved in stone, but drawn on a map: Egypt, the unified kingdom that had stood for millennia, fractured in two. This was the 15th and final pillar of the cult's dominance, the point where economic rivalry blossomed into full-blown political division. The era known as the Third Intermediate Period saw a stark new reality. In the north, a line of pharaohs ruled from a new capital at Tanis in the Nile Delta, clinging to the traditional titles of kingship. But in the south, in the rich lands of Upper Egypt, a different power held sway. The true rulers were the high priests of Amun in Thebes, men who now governed a sovereign territory. They might offer a polite, nominal acknowledgement to the king in Tanis, but it was an empty formality. The south answered to the god and by extension to his chief priest. This split was far more than a political disagreement. It was an economic partition, the logical conclusion of centuries of building a separate, self-sufficient empire. The Theban region, with its sprawling temple estates, its direct pipeline to Nubian gold mines, and its vast agricultural surplus, simply sealed its borders. It operated as an independent economic zone. The grain from its fields no longer fed the northern army. the gold from its mountains no longer gilded the Tanite king's statues. Every resource was now reinvested locally, sustaining the Theban state. The cult's meticulously built infrastructure proved it could replicate every essential function of kingship. Its White House administration became the state's bureaucracy. Its temple guards and conscripted labor forces evolved into a standing military. Its treasuries functioned as the national bank. For the people of Thebes, life went on with remarkable continuity. The same officials collected the harvests, the same workshops produced goods, the same granaries ensured food security. The only thing that had changed was the name and location of the ultimate authority they served. The pharaoh had become a distant figurehead, while the high priest was the present, practical ruler who managed the economy that fed them. This successful partition stands as history's definitive verdict on the cult's economic power. They did not need to conquer the throne through force. They had spent centuries building a parallel system so robust, so comprehensive, that when the central state weakened, their domain simply continued operating unaffected. The kingdom of Amun had been a reality long before the maps were redrawn. The division of Egypt merely made visible what the ledgers had been saying for generations, that the true seat of power and prosperity in the south was not a royal palace but a god's treasury. Even the most profound division could not last forever under the same sky. The north would not simply accept the loss of Egypt's spiritual and economic heartland. A new dynasty arose in the Nile Delta, one born not of ancient pharaonic bloodlines, but from the descendants of Libyan mercenaries who had settled in Egypt generations before. Their leader, Sheshonq I, founder of the 22nd dynasty, was a shrewd military man who understood that to rule a unified Egypt, he must first control Thebes. His chosen weapon for this conquest was not an army but his own family. His strategy was deceptively simple and on the surface a masterstroke. He would install his own son, a prince named Euput, into the very seat of his rival's power, making him the high priest of Amun. The plan was to co-opt the temple's immense authority from within, turning the cult's own structure into an instrument of royal control. For a moment, it must have seemed perfect. The northern king's own flesh and blood would now oversee the southern treasury, command its militia, and speak with the god's voice. The ancient rift, it appeared, might be healed by a bond of blood. But the cult of Amun had a centuries-long history of absorbing foreign influences and making them its own. The temple was not just a title to be worn, it was a living organism with its own traditions, loyalties, and deep institutional memory. A young Libyan prince sent to Thebes was immersed in a world far older and more insular than his father's court in the north. He was raised not among soldiers and Delta nobles, but among the elite scribes and priests of Karnak. His teachers were men whose families had served Amun for generations. His daily life revolved around the temple's intricate rituals and its sprawling economic administration. Over years, his primary identity began to shift. He was no longer just a sentinel for his father's dynasty. He was the god's first servant, the steward of a legacy that predated kings. His success, his prestige, and his power were now measured by the prosperity of the temple estates, not the political fortunes of Tanis. This created a dangerous psychological split, a conflict of loyalty that would define this era. The prince, now high priest, often found his interests aligned more closely with the Theban elite who depended on the temple's economy than with a distant royal father whose policies might threaten that economy. The line between royal and priestly lineage, which Sheshonq hoped to erase, became hopelessly blurred instead. This period became a delicate, often tense dance of shared power. The northern pharaohs continued to appoint their sons as high priests, seeking to maintain a foothold. Yet the temple's economic machinery, its granaries, workshops, and trade networks, continued to operate with its legendary autonomy. The Theban administration still collected local revenues, managed its workforce, and funded its projects with minimal reference to the north. It was a fragile equilibrium, a cold peace built on a fundamental contradiction. The king needed the temple's legitimacy and wealth to rule, but the temple, now led by the king's own kin, guarded that wealth for its own perpetuation. This balance was so precarious it occasionally shattered into open, if quiet, conflict. There are hints in the historical record of Thebes withholding its resources, or of a high priest acting in direct opposition to royal decrees. The god's treasury had become a seat of such inherent power that even a royal prince, once installed there, could transform from an agent of the crown into a guardian of the sanctuary. The attempt to conquer from within had, in many ways, only deepened the temple's political insulation, proving that its true power resided not in any individual, but in the enduring, irresistible gravity of its economic empire. The ultimate test of any institution is not how it survives in times of peace, but who seeks to claim it in times of chaos. For generations, the cult of Amun had been the prize over which Egyptian factions fought. Yet its gravitational pull was so strong it finally drew in a power from beyond Egypt's traditional borders, one that had been watching and learning for centuries. The final, dramatic chapter in this ancient power struggle arrived not from the north but from the deep south, from the kingdom of Kush in what is now Sudan. These Nubian rulers, based at Napata, had grown up in the shadow of Amun's southern mountain at Jebel Barkal. They were not outsiders to the god's cult, they were its devoted heirs, raised on the belief that they were the true guardians of his worship. By the 8th century BC, they looked north and saw a divided, weakened Egypt, with rival dynasties in the delta squabbling while the great temple of Karnak languished under what they viewed as northern neglect. To the Kushite king Ptolemaic, this was not an invasion for plunder. It was a sacred crusade, a restoration. He marched north not as a foreign conqueror, but as a pious liberator, arriving at Thebes as a devotee coming home. His campaign was framed entirely within the cult's own logic. He presented himself as the instrument of Amun's own oracle, the chosen one sent to cleanse the land and restore the god's rituals to their proper glory. In the stunning victory stela he erected, Ptolemaic does not boast of slaughter. Instead, he meticulously details how each petty northern ruler he subdued had failed in their duties to Amun, and how he, the pious Kushite, made them swear new oaths of loyalty to the god. This was a masterclass in ideological warfare. He understood that to control Egypt, you must first control the narrative of Amun. Most significantly, the Kushite kings did not dismantle the temple's economic machine they had admired for so long. They had no desire to break the system. They wanted to sit at its head. Ptolemaic and his successors seamlessly stepped into the dual role that had been evolving for centuries. They became both pharaoh and the ultimate high priest of Amun. They ruled from the palace, but their authority flowed directly from the sanctuary. They left the temple's administration intact, its estates untouched, its treasuries full. Why would they change it? The entire Kushite strategy of rule was built upon harnessing this pre-existing, perfectly tuned engine of wealth and legitimacy. They became the living embodiment of the cult's final victory. For a time, it worked brilliantly. The Kushite 25th dynasty presided over a renaissance of Egyptian art and architecture, all funded through and dedicated to Amun. This episode reveals the ultimate truth about the cult's power. Its entrenched economic and spiritual authority had become the master key to the kingdom. The throne, the army, even the borders of Egypt were now secondary. The real prize, the source of all legitimacy and wealth, was the god's treasury and the administrative network that fed it. So powerful was this institution that when the very definition of Egyptian was in flux, foreign rulers saw that the fastest path to legitimacy was not to conquer the pharaoh's crown, but to become the high priest. They knew the true ruler of Egypt was not whoever sat in the palace, but whoever held the keys to Karnak. In the end, the cult did not just rival the pharaohs. It created a template for power so durable that it outlived native dynasties, inviting in new kings who would bend the knee not to a man, but to an idea and an economy that had become eternal. But to truly grasp the staggering scale of what the priests of Thebes built, we must look beyond the walls of Karnak. Across Egypt, other gods commanded reverence and wealth. The Temple of Ptah in Memphis, the ancient capital, was a center of craft and creation. The Sun Temple of Ra in Heliopolis was venerable and influential. Yet none of these powerful institutions ever achieved the same level of political and economic sovereignty as the cult of Amun. Their stories highlight just how extraordinary the Theban phenomenon really was. The priesthood of Ptah, for instance, was deeply woven into the fabric of the royal court in Memphis. Its high priests were often royal princes or top officials, their authority deriving directly from their proximity to the pharaoh. This was a strength but also a limitation. Their wealth and influence were tied to the fortunes of the ruling dynasty in the north. When the royal capital moved or a dynasty fell, the Memphis cult's power waned with it. They were a pillar of the state, not a rival to it. Similarly, the cult of Ra at Heliopolis, while intellectually prestigious as the center of solar theology, never amassed the same consolidated, independent land empire. Its holdings were more scattered, its administration more integrated with the crown's own tax collectors. It lacked that critical, self-contained economic engine. So what made Amun different? Three factors converged to create a perfect storm. First was theology. Amun was not just a god, he was the king of the gods, the divine father of the pharaoh himself. This national, royal identity meant that donations to Amun were not just pious acts, they were investments in the very concept of kingship. Second was the sheer, relentless concentration of royal gifts. Pharaoh after pharaoh, especially during the empire-building new kingdom, poured the spoils of victory into Thebes alone, creating a critical mass of wealth in one location that overwhelmed all others. Third, and perhaps most decisively, was geography. No other cult controlled a foreign territory like Nubia. The temples of Ptah or Ra had wealthy estates, but they did not command the direct pipeline to gold mines and African trade that functioned as a separate kingdom. The Theban priesthood combined the spiritual authority of a national church with the economic reach of a colonial trading company and the administrative rigor of a modern corporation. Other cults might possess one or two of these attributes, but only Amun's possessed all three, woven together over centuries. This unique alignment allowed it to build walls not just of stone, but of financial and political independence. While other priesthoods rose and fell with the royal favor of the moment, the cult of Amun built a foundation so deep that it could survive and even thrive when the throne itself was empty or contested. It was a singular phenomenon, a lesson in how faith, when fused with flawless economic strategy, can rewrite the rules of power itself. The numbers etched on ancient papyrus are as revealing as any temple wall. To truly comprehend the scale of this divine corporation, we must turn to the physical evidence it left behind, the administrative paperwork that survived the ages. A single document, the Great Harris Papyrus from the reign of Ramesses III, offers a breathtaking audit. This scroll, stretching over 130 feet long, is essentially a royal inventory of Egypt's entire religious economy. It meticulously catalogues the estates, personnel, and offerings dedicated to the gods, and the figures for Amun are nothing short of staggering. The papyrus records that the Theban temple owned over 430,000 acres of arable land, more than 500,000 head of cattle, and employed over 80,000 people across its domains. To put that in perspective, the cult of Amun controlled roughly 1/3 of all the temple land in Egypt and commanded a workforce larger than many cities of the era. This was not a vague claim of influence, it was a quantified, documented economic supremacy. These numbers, written in neat hieratic script, are the balance sheets of a rival state. But the evidence extends far beyond a single royal survey. Scattered throughout Thebes are the legal cornerstones of this empire, carved in stone for eternity. Donation stelae stand as permanent title deeds, recording a pharaoh's gift of a specific town or region to the god, complete with its borders and inhabitants. Alongside them are the powerful tax exemption decrees like the one from Seti I, which explicitly shield the temple's assets from royal interference. Then there are the humble, everyday records, the administrative ostraca, which are broken pottery shards used as notepads. These fragments capture the mundane pulse of the operation, listing deliveries of grain, distributions of tools to workers, or the output of a specific workshop on a given day. Together, these sources reveal a bureaucracy obsessed with detail, tracking every loaf of bread, every jar of oil, and every block of stone that moved through its system. It was a machine run on paperwork, a divine enterprise managed with the precision of a modern multinational. We can even put faces and names to the managers of this machine. The tomb biographies of high officials, like the vizier Rikmaya who served under Pharaoh Thutmose III, provide a vivid job description. Rikmaya's tomb walls depict him overseeing the workshops of Amun, inspecting stacks of tribute from foreign lands and receiving reports from scribes. The accompanying text boasts of his role in provisioning the temple's countless laborers and craftsmen. These are not just scenes of religious devotion, they are portraits of a chief executive officer at work, a man whose power and prestige derived directly from his administrative control over the god's wealth. These personal accounts humanize the vast numbers, showing us the elite class of scribes and stewards who made the system function, whose careers were built on their ability to manage the most lucrative portfolio in the ancient world. Ultimately, this mountain of evidence from the grand papyrus to the humble pottery shard serves one profound purpose. It confirms, beyond any doubt, that the cult of Amun was not merely a wealthy religious institution. It was a fully realized corporate entity, a state within a state with its own assets, its own labor force, its own legal protections, and its own meticulous accounting department. The priests were not just spiritual leaders, they were chief financial officers, and the temple walls at Karnak were merely the magnificent headquarters of history's first and most enduring holy conglomerate. This immense economic machine did not grind forward on fear alone. For the common people of Thebes, the towering power of the cult of Amun was not an abstract threat. It was the very architecture of their daily survival. The temple's authority rested on a 20th, and perhaps most resilient, pillar, a deeply embedded social contract with the population it governed. The priesthood understood that true power requires not just control but consent. They masterfully cultivated this consent by positioning themselves not as distant overlords, but as the benevolent stewards of the god's bounty, directly responsible for the community's welfare. In practical terms, this meant guaranteed employment, whether as a scribe in the White House, a stonemason on the endless temple expansions, or a farmer on the divine estates. Thousands of households derived their livelihood directly from the temple's operations. This created a vast, interconnected network of families whose economic fate was tied to the cult's prosperity. Their loyalty was not blind faith, it was a rational investment in their own stability. That stability was tested most severely during the Nile's inevitable failures. In years of poor flood and meager harvests, when the royal granaries might strain to feed the army and the capital, the temple's own vast reserves became a lifeline. The high priest could authorize the distribution of grain from the god's storehouses to the local population. This act, framed as Amun's divine mercy, was a powerful demonstration of practical benevolence. For a family facing hunger, the temple was not a theological concept. It was the institution that put bread in their hands. This created a profound, personal debt of gratitude that no edict from a distant pharaoh could ever match. Alongside this material security, the cult provided a vital sense of cosmic and social order. The magnificent public festivals where the god statue was paraded through the streets were not merely religious spectacles. They were communal celebrations, moments of shared identity and awe, funded and orchestrated by the priesthood. They reinforced the idea that the temple's immense wealth was being used correctly for the glory of the god and the enjoyment of his people. Through this combination of economic security, crisis relief, and cultural stewardship, the cult of Amun built a formidable grassroots foundation. The high priest became a figure of both spiritual awe and practical reliance. So when tensions eventually flared between Thebes and a pharaoh ruling from the distant delta, the local calculus for the people was clear. Who held their loyalty, a remote king who demanded taxes and conscripts for far-off wars, or the local institution that provided their jobs, protected them from famine, and rooted their world in sacred ritual? For the regional elite, the mayors, the wealthy landowners, the military officers, the choice was similarly pragmatic. Their fortunes were intertwined with the temple's economic network. Their sons were educated in its schools, their daughters might marry into priestly families, and their business deals were sanctioned by its oracles. Supporting the priesthood was not rebellion, it was an act of preserving the ecosystem that sustained their own status and wealth. This public perception, carefully nurtured over centuries, transformed the temple's economic power into a form of social capital. The cult did not just rival the pharaohs in treasure, it surpassed them in the currency that ultimately matters most, the willing allegiance of the people it served. Even the most perfectly engineered system contains the seeds of its own vulnerability. For all its monumental strength, the economic empire of Amun was not immune to the very human frailties that plague any concentration of power. The 21st pillar of its story reveals the inherent limits of its dominance, a reality defined by internal corruption, administrative strain, and a dangerous dependence on the world outside its walls. The temple's wealth, vast enough to rival kingdoms, also proved a powerful temptation for those entrusted to manage it. Within the priesthood's own ranks, the potential for greed and factional infighting was a constant, quiet threat. A high-ranking priest overseeing a distant Nubian gold mine, for example, might be tempted to skim a portion of the precious metal for his own family's benefit, creating a private fortune that diverted resources from the central treasury. Or rival families within the Theban elite could vie for the position of high priest itself, turning the sacred succession into a political contest fueled by the desire to control the god's immense portfolio. These internal power struggles, while rarely documented openly, would have sapped institutional cohesion and diverted energy from the meticulous administration that was the cult's greatest strength. The system's own scale became a liability, overseeing hundreds of thousands of acres of land, herds numbering in the hundreds of thousands, and a workforce spread across Egypt and Nubia was a logistical challenge of almost impossible complexity. A scribe in a remote estate office could easily falsify records, underreporting harvests to sell the surplus for personal gain. A local overseer might demand excessive labor from the farmers under his control, breeding resentment that undermined the temple's carefully cultivated image of benevolent stewardship. The very bureaucracy that empowered the cult could become bloated and inefficient, with layers of administrators more focused on their own status than on the economic health of the whole. This internal fragmentation meant the temple's power, while immense on paper, could be leaky and inconsistent in practice, vulnerable to the silent corrosion of petty corruption and mismanagement. Yet the most profound vulnerability was external. The cult's empire was ultimately parasitic, a term used here in a strictly economic sense. It fed on the overall health and stability of the Egyptian state. Its model required a functioning kingdom to protect its borders, maintain the trade routes its ships sailed, and produce the agricultural surplus it could then manage. If a foreign invasion, say by the formidable armies of Assyria, shattered the kingdom's defenses, the temple's isolated wealth would be a glittering target. Its granaries could be seized, its workshops destroyed, and its trade network severed. Similarly, a prolonged kingdom-wide drought or a dramatic failure of the Nile flood would not respect the tax-exempt status of the god's lands. While the temple's reserves might last longer, a complete collapse of the agricultural base would eventually drain even its deepest storehouses, leading to famine, social unrest, and the breakdown of the very labor system it depended upon. The cult's power existed in a delicate, symbiotic dance with the pharaoh's authority. They needed each other, yet they were locked in perpetual rivalry. This balance was so precarious it occasionally shattered into open conflict. There were periods, hinted at in fragmented records, when tensions between Thebes and the royal court escalated to the point of civil strife, where the temple's militia might face the pharaoh's own troops. These moments reveal the double-edged nature of the cult's economic might. The same wealth that allowed it to act as a stabilizing force during royal weakness could also fund rebellion and fracture the kingdom during a crisis of succession or policy. The rivalry that enriched Thebes could also destabilize the very civilization it was built to serve, proving that no power, not even one blessed by the gods, operates in a vacuum. Its greatest strength was also its point of deepest exposure, tied irrevocably to the fate of the land it sought to both mirror and master. The shadow of Amun's economic empire stretched far beyond the last native pharaoh. Centuries after the Kushites departed and Egypt fell under the control of foreign dynasties, first the Greek Ptolemies and then the Romans, a fundamental truth remained unchanged. To govern the Nile Valley, you had to govern its temples. The administrative and financial template forged by the cult of Amun did not vanish. It became the operating system for the entire country, adapted and managed by every new ruler who sought to harness Egypt's legendary wealth. The great sanctuaries at Thebes, Memphis, and Edfu still functioned as vast corporate estates, controlling land, labor, and local trade. When Ptolemy I took the throne, he and his successors recognized this entrenched power. Their strategy was one of brilliant, calculated co-option. On one hand, they performed the ancient part of the pharaoh with lavish generosity, funding magnificent new temple constructions like the colossal complex at Edfu, dedicated to the god Horus. These were not acts of pure piety, they were strategic investments buying the loyalty of the powerful priestly class and the population that revered them. The message was clear: the new foreign king respected the old gods and would be their benefactor. Yet simultaneously, running parallel to this sacred generosity, the Ptolemies built a sophisticated and intrusive state bureaucracy designed to monitor and ultimately control that very temple wealth. They introduced a complex system of banking, currency, and detailed tax records. Royal officials called oikonomoi were appointed to oversee temple finances, ensuring that a significant portion of the agricultural surplus from temple lands now flowed into the royal treasury in Alexandria, not just the sanctuary's own storehouses. The Romans who followed tightened this control even further. Emperor Augustus, after defeating Cleopatra and Mark Antony, effectively nationalized the Egyptian temple system. While temples retained their lands and income, they now paid a heavy annual tax to Rome. The position of high priest was often appointed directly by the Roman administration, transforming a once independent power broker into a state functionary. The sacred barges of the gods were even inventoried, and their precious metal adornments carefully recorded by Roman accountants, a stark symbol of where ultimate authority now resided. This dual approach, lavish gift-giving paired with stringent bureaucratic oversight, was the direct legacy of the Amun model. Every foreign ruler learned the same lesson the native pharaohs had learned too late, that the temple's economic power was too great to destroy, but too dangerous to leave unchecked. The system perfected in Thebes, the temple as a self-sufficient administrative and economic unit, proved so efficient and resilient that it persisted as the backbone of regional governance for nearly 1,000 years after the cult's political peak. The gods' corporation had become the state's preferred method for managing the countryside, a testament to an economic innovation so powerful it outlived empires, languages, and faiths. The economic empire of Amun is not a relic confined to papyrus and stone. Its core dynamics, the fusion of spiritual capital with vast material wealth, the pursuit of institutional autonomy, and the resulting tension with central authority, form a blueprint that has been replicated, intentionally or not, throughout human history. This ancient case study offers a lens through which to view the enduring dance between faith, finance, and political power. Consider the medieval Catholic Church in Europe. Like the Theban priesthood, it began with a profound spiritual mandate. Through royal donations from pious kings seeking divine favor, it amassed enormous tracts of land, becoming the largest landowner on the continent. It developed its own legal system, its own taxation in the form of tithes, and maintained a network of monasteries that functioned as economic hubs of agriculture, education, and craft. The Pope, much like the High Priest of Amun, could crown emperors or excommunicate them, wielding a moral authority that translated into direct political and economic leverage. The parallel is striking. A spiritual institution evolving into a sovereign economic power that kings and emperors had to negotiate with, often as uneasy partners or rivals. But the lessons extend beyond religious bodies. Look at the modern multinational corporation. While devoid of theological doctrine, these entities can exhibit a similar trajectory. They begin with an initial advantage, perhaps a revolutionary patent or a dominant market position, granted or protected within a legal framework, a modern form of royal charter. Through relentless growth, vertical integration, and global supply chains, they build self-contained economic ecosystems. They command resources and labor across international borders, influence legislation through lobbying, and cultivate public loyalty through branding that borders on the ideological. Their annual revenues can surpass the gross domestic product of mid-sized nations, granting them a form of soft power and autonomy that challenges the regulatory reach of any single government. They, too, can become non-state actors whose primary loyalty is to institutional growth and shareholder value, sometimes creating friction with the national interests of their home countries or the societies they operate within. The story of Amun demonstrates a universal mechanism, how any institution, be it a temple, a church, or a corporation, can leverage a foundational advantage into a self-sustaining cycle. Spiritual authority or brand loyalty attracts resources. Those resources fund expansion and create dependency, and that dependency solidifies influence, which then attracts even more resources. The danger, as Egypt learned, emerges when this cycle spins beyond the counterbalance of a central, public authority. It creates a rivalry that can fragment cohesive governance, as priorities diverge between the institution's perpetual growth and the state's broader responsibility to its people. This is not a call to judge ancient priests or modern CEOs, but to recognize a pattern. Understanding how the cult of Amun gained its power is not just an exercise in archaeology. It is a masterclass in institutional economics, a reminder to always ask where true sovereignty lies in any complex society. Is it with the elected government, the revered tradition, or the balance sheet that quietly underwrites them both? The silent bargains made in the shadow of Karnak's pylons are still being negotiated in boardrooms and capitals today, proving that while the gods may change, the fundamental equations of power remain hauntingly familiar. The true motives of the Theban high priests remain a subject of quiet debate in academic circles today. Was their immense wealth always a tool for eventual political takeover, or was it simply the ultimate form of institutional security? Egyptologists examining the same stone inscriptions and papyrus fragments can arrive at very different interpretations of this ancient power struggle. One prominent school of thought suggests the priesthood never truly sought to abolish the pharaonic office. Their goal, according to this view, was not replacement but the maximization of autonomy. They wanted to create an untouchable sphere of influence, a divine corporation so deeply embedded in the kingdom's fabric that no pharaoh could ever challenge its core operations. In this reading, the high priests were brilliant bureaucrats, not aspiring kings. They understood that their power was safest when the throne was just strong enough to protect the borders, but not strong enough to audit the temple's ledgers. Their rivalry was a carefully managed tension, a way to ensure the monarchy remained dependent and therefore compliant with their interests. The other perspective paints a more deliberate picture. Scholars here see a slow, inevitable creep of authority. They point to the gradual accumulation of military and civil titles by men like Herihor, and later, the clear political division of the kingdom. This was not an accident of bureaucratic overreach, they argue, but a calculated generational strategy. Each new high priest inherited not just a religious role, but a political portfolio, and each quietly expanded its boundaries. The end goal in this interpretation was not just autonomy within a system, but control of the system itself. The ultimate proof for these historians is the simple fact that Egypt did split in two, with Thebes ruling the south as a sovereign state. This could not have happened without a long-standing ambition to translate economic weight into outright sovereignty. The debate often hinges on elusive details, like the precise proportion of Egypt's total wealth controlled by the god's treasury at its peak. Was it 1/3, as some records suggest, or even more? And how separate were the temple and state economies really? Did grain from the royal estates ever mix with temple stores during a famine, or were the systems kept rigidly apart by design? The answers are not clear because the ancient scribes had no reason to write a comparative economic analysis for future historians. They recorded what served their institution's needs. Even the grand titles are ambiguous. When a high priest is called chief of the army, did he actually command troops in the field, or was it a ceremonial honor? The stone carvings do not say. This ongoing scholarly discussion does more than highlight academic disagreement. It reveals the profound complexity of power itself. The story of Amun's cult is not a simple tale of good versus evil, or even of church versus state. It is a case study in how institutions, even those built on faith, operate in the real world. Motives are rarely pure ideology or naked greed. They are usually a tangled mix of tradition, opportunity, survival instinct, and the personal ambitions of individuals within a vast system. The high priests may have seen themselves as faithful stewards protecting the god's legacy from a potentially impious or incompetent king. The pharaohs likely saw themselves as the rightful rulers being slowly suffocated by an overmighty priesthood. Both were probably right from their own perspectives. This reminds us that history is rarely a chess game with one clear winner, but more often a long, intricate dance between competing centers of gravity, each navigating a shared space, each convinced of its own necessity. The silent negotiations that happened in Thebes echo wherever large, enduring institutions find their interests both aligned with and opposed to the governments they exist alongside. Behind every ledger entry and royal decree stood individuals whose ambition turned a slow economic drift into a gripping human drama. The saga of the cult of Amun was ultimately driven by formidable personalities who saw the institution's potential and seized it, each adding a new layer to its authority. On one side, we have the high priests who skillfully navigated periods of royal weakness. Consider Amenhotep, who served as high priest under the fading pharaoh Ramesses XI. With the king's power crumbling in the north, Amenhotep did not just administer the temple, he effectively ruled the entire southern half of Egypt as a de facto governor, his authority flowing directly from Thebes rather than from the distant throne. He set a precedent proving that the temple's infrastructure could govern a nation. Then there is the iconic figure of Herihor, whose story embodies the final, audacious leap. He began as a general, a military man, but through shrewd maneuvering, he ascended to become high priest. He did not stop there. In temple reliefs at Karnak, he had himself depicted wearing the royal uraeus cobra on his brow and his name enclosed in a pharaoh's cartouche. This was no quiet power grab. It was a public declaration that the roles of king and high priest had merged into one. Another master of behind-the-scenes power was Pinarjum I. While officially a high priest, he took on the extraordinary responsibility of safeguarding the royal mummies of earlier pharaohs, relocating them to a hidden cache for protection during a time of turmoil. This act was deeply symbolic, positioning him as the guardian of Egypt's sacred past, a custodian of legacy whose moral authority was immense. He ruled through influence and tradition, a kingmaker in priestly robes. Opposing these men were pharaohs who recognized the threat and attempted to counter it. Ramesses III, one of Egypt's last great warrior kings, implemented administrative reforms aimed at curbing corruption and reigning in the economic independence of powerful temples, including Thebes. His efforts, recorded in the Great Harris Papyrus, show a clear understanding of the imbalance. Later, Pharaoh Sheshonq I tried a different tactic, seeking not to crush the cult but to co-opt it by installing his own son as high priest in Thebes, a strategy of integration that aimed to turn the temple's power into an arm of the crown. These figures, with their complex alliances, family manipulations, and bold public claims, did more than manage an institution. They turned an abstract economic trend into a dramatic historical narrative of rivalry, negotiation, and audacious ambition. Their stories prove a timeless truth that systemic power shifts, no matter how vast or slow-moving, are always mediated, accelerated, and given shape by the strategies and desires of the people who stand at the levers of control. Thebes fell not to a rival pharaoh but to a storm from the east. For all its economic ingenuity and political maneuvering, the cult of Amun could not withstand the arrival of a new kind of empire, one built for pure conquest. The Assyrian war machine under King Ashurbanipal swept into Egypt in the 7th century before the Common Era with a singular, devastating purpose. Their target was not just territory but treasure. The legendary wealth of Karnak, the very engine of the cult's power for 1,000 years, now painted a target on the city. The Assyrians did not come to negotiate with priests or interpret oracles. They came to take. The sack of Thebes was a catastrophe of unimaginable scale. The great city, once the heart of a divine economic empire, was systematically looted. The storerooms of the White House, the workshops of the House of Gold, the inner sanctums where the god statue stood adorned with Nubian electrum, all were breached. Precious metals were stripped, archives of papyrus were burned or scattered, and the population was subjected to the terrible realities of ancient siege warfare. In a matter of months, the accumulated capital of centuries was hauled away to Nineveh. The physical and psychological blow was fatal to the cult's worldly supremacy. The institution survived, but as a ghost of its former self. Its political rivalry with the pharaohs ended not with a treaty or a coup, but in the smoke and rubble left by a foreign army. The ultimate historical irony is profound. The cult's magnificent, self-contained wealth, designed to create independence from the Egyptian crown, is precisely what made it irresistible to a predator that recognized no divine legitimacy, only plunder. This final pillar of the story is one of sobering reckoning. it reveals a vulnerability that no amount of administrative genius or spiritual authority could shield. Internal power struggles, no matter how carefully managed, can consume a society's focus, leaving its borders and its greatest treasures exposed. The ruins of Karnak, even in their later, rebuilt grandeur, stand as a silent lesson. They remind us that the most formidable rival is sometimes not the one you are watching, but the one you never saw coming, drawn by the very glitter of the power you worked so long to build. The story of Amun's priests is a testament to the quiet, relentless power of administration. Their journey reveals that the most profound shifts in history are not always marked by battles or dramatic revolutions, but by the steady, patient accumulation of assets and influence. Over generations, they transformed spiritual capital into an economic empire so vast it created a new kind of sovereignty, one that existed alongside and eventually challenged the throne itself. This narrative dismantles the myth of the pharaoh as an unquestioned autocrat, exposing instead a delicate and often tense partnership. The true ruler of Egypt was for centuries a partnership between the palace and the sanctuary, a balance of power that ultimately tipped in favor of the institution that mastered the ledger. Their legacy is a blueprint written in stone and papyrus, showing us how faith, when paired with flawless economic strategy, can rewrite the very rules of a civilization. It prompts a final, lingering question for us today, in a world of modern institutions and vast corporations. Where does true power actually reside? Is it in the visible symbols of authority, or in the control of the systems that generate wealth, secure loyalty, and outlast individual leaders? The silent bargains struck in the shadow of Karnak's pylons continue to echo wherever influence is built not just by decree, but by design. If this exploration into one of history's most fascinating rivalries captivated you, there are countless more stories of hidden power waiting to be uncovered. Your curiosity guides what we explore next, so be sure to subscribe and join the conversation below.